Firefighters were called to a rowhouse on North 6th Street in Philadelphia just before 5 a.m. on October 9, 2004. 6 people were inside. All 6 died. Investigators who went through the wreckage afterward found that the fire had started in the living room and had not started on its own. 2 cans of gasoline had been thrown through the front door, and shots had been fired up the staircase in the seconds before, aimed at keeping anyone from getting out. 4 of the 6 people who died were children. The house belonged to the family of Eugene Coleman, a man who had agreed to testify against a Philadelphia drug dealer named Coleman Savage. Savage was sitting in a federal detention cell the night of the fire. He had ordered it, and his sister had carried that order across the city to 2 men willing to carry it out. That decision to burn a family alive over one man's cooperation with the government is why Coleman Savage is remembered as one of the most violent men to come out of Philadelphia. Savage was born January 1st, 1975 in Philadelphia. He also went by Bonnie, Yusuf Billa, and Joseph Amo. He attended Frankfort High School and boxed at the Front Street Gym in North Philadelphia. He had one professional fight and won it. When he was 13, his father died of cancer. After that, boxing was no longer the plan. He started selling PCP, known on the street as Sherm Oils, out of his mother's house on Darien Street. He moved into crack, then cocaine and marijuana, and built a crew that controlled corners along Erie Avenue in Hunting Park. By the late 1990s, he was moving 5 to 7 kilograms of cocaine at a time, cutting and repressing the product to stretch every gram into more profit. He put his own name on the operation. It became known as the Coleman Savage Organization, or KSO. The KSO ran on violence. In March 1998, a driver named Kenneth Lassiter bumped Savage's car while parking. Savage demanded payment. Lassiter apologized instead. Savage shot him dead on the street. A rival dealer named Tibius Flowers watched it happen. Savage was arrested for that killing in 1999, but the arrest did not stop the business. He kept dealing while out on house arrest. In 2000, one of his own suppliers later testified that Savage moved between 160 and 200 kilograms of cocaine in a 6-month stretch. That same year, Savage had a partner, Mansour Abdullah, killed over a dispute about money. In 2001, he ordered the killing of Carlton Brown, a man he believed had killed a friend of his. In 2003, he ordered the killing of Barry Parker, a rival who tried to take a corner belonging to one of Savage's dealers. Also, in 2003, Savage suspected an associate named Tyrone Tolliver of being an informant. Tolliver was shot in the head by one of Savage's enforcers, and his body was dumped by Eugene Coleman, who was Savage's right-hand man at the time. Savage's trial for the Lassiter murder began in 2004. Tibius Flowers was the prosecution's key witness. The night before the trial started, Flowers was shot dead in his car on the same corner where Lassiter had been killed 6 years earlier. Without his testimony, the case collapsed and Savage walked free on April 8, 2004. 4 days later, federal agents arrested him again. This time it was drug trafficking and money laundering charges, the product of a 3-year FBI investigation. Eugene Coleman was one of the people cooperating with that investigation. In December 2005, Savage was convicted on 14 federal charges and sentenced to 30 years in prison. By then, Coleman was in federal custody too, and he had agreed to testify against Savage in the case that would eventually center on the firebombing. Savage found out. From inside the federal detention center in Philadelphia, he began threatening anyone connected to Coleman. He was recorded on prison phone calls talking about killing witnesses, mothers, and children. In October 2004, he gave the order to burn Coleman's house down. His sister, Kidada Savage, passed the instructions to a hitman named Lamont Lewis, drove him to the block, and pointed out the house. Lewis brought his cousin, Robert Merritt, along. At around 5 a.m. on October 9, 2004, the 2 men fired shots into the house and threw in cans of gasoline. Coleman's mother, Marcella, died in the fire. So did his 15-month-old son, his 15-year-old nephew, his 12-year-old nephew, his 10-year-old niece, and his 34-year-old cousin. The family dog died too. Savage was recorded joking about the deaths afterward, saying they should have poured barbecue sauce on the bodies. It took years to build the case against him. In 2009, Savage, Lewis, Merritt, and a 4th man, Stephen Northington, were indicted for the firebombing. The trial began in February 2013. Lamont Lewis testified against his former boss in exchange for a 40-year sentence instead of the death penalty. On May 13, 2013, a jury convicted Savage on 17 counts, including 12 murders. On May 31, 2013, the same jury sentenced him to death. Kidada Savage was convicted separately and sentenced to life in prison in February 2014. In December 2024, President Joe Biden commuted Savage's death sentence to life without parole. That is the shape of the story. A Philadelphia street dealer built a cocaine empire through violence, could not tolerate the idea of being informed on, and ended up ordering the deaths of 6 people, most of them children, to punish one man for talking to the government. What follows is how he got the power to give that order, why an informant became his obsession, and how a fire on North 6th Street became the crime that defined him. To understand how a street dealer from North Philadelphia ended up with the reach to order a family burned alive from inside a federal cell, the story has to start with how he built the empire that gave him that reach in the first place. Coleman Savage came up in the Richard Allen Homes, a housing project in North Philadelphia with its own deep roots in the city's underworld, a neighborhood where members of the Philadelphia Black Mafia once held their meetings and where a man's name traveled block by block long before it ever reached the courtroom. In a city like Philadelphia, a single corner could make somebody rich, and it could just as easily get somebody killed. Men bled for stretches of pavement no wider than a driveway because that pavement was the only asset they had. Savage's father sold drugs to keep the lights on, and the family eventually moved to Hunting Park, where young Coleman watched the trade up close before he ever touched it himself. Then, the ground shifted under him. His father was diagnosed with cancer and died when Savage was 13 years old, and a boy who should have still been chasing a jump shot or a boxing title was suddenly expected to carry weight he was nowhere near ready to carry. He leaned into boxing first, training at the Front Street Gym the way plenty of North Philly kids did, chasing a discipline that at least came with rules and a referee. He fought once as a professional and won. But a boxing career is a slow build, and a 13-year-old with no father and a household to help support does not have the luxury of a slow build. So alongside the gym, he started moving Sherm oils, PCP-dipped cigarettes sold a few dollars at a time, and soon after that, crack. He ran the oldest opening play in the business. Give the product away for a day or two, let it sell itself, and wait for the customers to come back chasing the same high, wallets open. He watched the real money move on Erie Avenue, a stretch controlled by a dealer named Tibius Flowers who was pulling serious weight off that block. Savage wanted in, and in his world, wanting in meant taking. He treated the corner the way a general treats a hostile position, crushing the competition rather than negotiating with it, and by the time the smoke cleared, Flowers' territory and several blocks beside it belonged to Coleman Savage. The money that came with those corners was not corner boy money anymore. It was the kind of money that rebuilds a man's entire life, and Savage rebuilt his around it. With scale came branding, and with branding came ambition most street dealers never reach. Savage began moving cocaine in bulk and stamped his own name on the product the way a company stamps a logo until the operation had an identity that outgrew the man who taught it to him. It became the Coleman Savage organization, and within a handful of years, Savage was moving weight that dwarfed anything his old mentor had ever touched. A supplier named Juan Rosado kept him stocked with product, and Savage's crew cut and repressed every kilo, stretching each brick further, squeezing more profit out of every gram before it hit the street. None of that scale would have survived a single season without muscle behind it, and Savage built that side of the business just as deliberately. In the early years, he handled the violence personally. As the organization grew, he had men who did it for him, enforcers like Kareem Bluntly and Lamont Lewis, soldiers who carried out instructions without asking why, the way men move when fear runs deeper than loyalty. A rival who tried to muscle in on one of Savage's corners turned up dead within days. A dealer operating in South Philadelphia who refused to fall in line was shot and left with his car burning around him. These were not isolated flare-ups. They were the terms of doing business with Coleman Savage, and every dealer in North Philly eventually learned them. His sister, Kadada Savage, ran a different lane of the operation, the discipline and logistics side rather than the trigger side, and by every account from people who dealt with her directly, she carried a coldness that matched or exceeded her brother's. She kept people in line, kept them quiet, and made sure loyalty inside the organization was never treated as optional. That role would matter enormously later. For now, it is enough to understand that the Coleman Savage organization was, from its earliest days, a family operation with a family chain of command, and every member of that family understood exactly what was expected of them. The clearest proof of how far Savage would go to protect what he had built came on a random afternoon in March 1998. He was parked near Tibius Flowers' old turf when a stranger named Kenneth Lassiter accidentally bumped his car while parallel parking, the kind of fender bender two strangers usually settle with an insurance card and a handshake. Savage demanded money on the spot. Lassiter apologized instead of paying. Savage pulled a gun and shot him dead right there on the street in full view of the very man whose corners he had taken over years earlier. Word of that killing spread through North Philadelphia within days, and it accomplished exactly what a killing like that is designed to accomplish. It told every dealer, every customer, and every bystander what happened to anyone who crossed Koboni Savage, whether the offense was real or imagined. Police finally caught up to him for that murder in September 1999, raiding an apartment in Mapleshade and finding a working cocaine kitchen inside, everything needed to cook, cut, and repress product for the street. Even that arrest barely slowed him down. Out on house arrest, operating from the same Darien Street house where he had once sold Sherm oils out the back door, Savage kept the pipeline moving. One of his own suppliers later testified that in a single 6-month window in 2000, Savage pushed between 160 and 200 kilograms of cocaine, each kilo worth tens of thousands of dollars on the street. In June 2001, federal agents hit one of his associates and recovered 5 kilograms of cocaine and $350,000 in cash in a single raid, a snapshot of how much money was flowing through an operation that on paper belonged to a man out on bail for murder. That is the empire Koboni Savage had built by the early 2000s. A supply chain stretching across North Philadelphia, a crew willing to kill on command, a sister running the business end with her own brand of discipline, and a body count already high enough to make his name feared on sight before he ever said a word. It is the reason that, years later, when he wanted 6 people dead from inside a federal detention cell, he had a sister ready to drive the plane across the city and a hitman standing by with 2 cans of gasoline. Power like that does not appear the night somebody needs it. It gets built corner by corner, killing by killing, across the better part of a decade. What that power could not survive and what it would eventually be undone by was a man inside Savage's own crew who decided he was done keeping quiet. An organization that could put a man in the ground for bumping a car needed people it trusted completely, and by the early 2000s, nobody stood closer to Koboni Savage than Eugene Coleman. Inside the KSO, Coleman was known as the Money Man. While Bluntly and Lewis handled the killing, Coleman moved product and managed the cash that flowed through the operation, the financial backbone standing next to a crew built entirely out of triggermen. That arrangement made him valuable. It also made him, in Savage's mind, a liability the moment federal pressure started closing in, because a man who runs the books knows where every body and every dollar is buried, and a man like that talking to the government could unravel everything Savage had spent a decade building. Savage's answer to that risk was not restraint. It was a philosophy he stated plainly on an FBI wiretap. Without the witness, there is no case. No witness, no crime. That single sentence was the operating principle behind everything that followed, and nowhere was it applied more coldly than in the killing of Tyrone Tolliver in March 2003. Tolliver was a friend of Coleman's who was struggling to fill a cocaine order, and Savage had grown suspicious he was cooperating with the police. Rather than confront him, Savage played along, sending Tolliver with Coleman to an apartment where the crew processed cocaine. Kareem Bluntly walked in and shot Tolliver in the head without a word. Then came the part that revealed exactly how calculated Savage's cruelty was. He had Coleman help dump the body. Killing Tolliver removed a possible informant. Forcing Coleman to help hide the corpse did something else entirely. It put Coleman's hands in the blood, made him an accomplice to murder, and ensured that if federal agents ever came calling, Coleman would have his own crime to answer for before he ever opened his mouth about Savage's. Savage understood Coleman was the soft point in his crew, and he built a wall of complicity around him specifically so that flipping would never be simple. He did not stop there. Around the same period, Savage gathered Lamont Lewis and 2 other senior members of the organization and made them swear a blood oath. If any one of them ever cooperated with federal investigators, their mothers would pay for it. Coleman was not in the room when that oath was sworn, but Savage made certain the message reached him anyway, because the point of a threat like that was never really about the men who swore it. It was about everyone who heard about it secondhand and understood exactly what kind of organization they belonged to and exactly what kind of leader they answered to. That leader's obsession with silencing witnesses reached its sharpest point in 2004 during his trial for the Lassiter murder. The prosecution's entire case rested on one man, Tibius Flowers, the same dealer who had watched Savage gun Lassiter down on the street 6 years earlier. Savage did not hide his intentions. Sitting behind bars awaiting trial, he told a fellow inmate that he was not worried about the case because Flowers would never make it to court. He said something close to the same thing to a second prisoner, effectively narrating what was about to happen before it happened. The night before the trial opened, Flowers was ambushed and shot dead in his parked car on the exact corner where Lassiter had been killed. No witnesses came forward. No suspect was named. But inside the prison system, another inmate would later say that Stephen Northington had bragged about killing Flowers, calling it sending a rat to rat heaven, and Savage himself told that same inmate he had beaten the case and expected to walk. For a moment, he was right. Without Flowers' testimony, the prosecution's case collapsed, and Savage walked out of custody on April 8, 2004, believing he had proven his own theory correct. killed the witness, and the case disappears with him. His freedom lasted 4 days. Federal agents arrested him again, this time on a sprawling drug trafficking indictment built over 3 years of wiretaps, surveillance, and testimony from people willing to cooperate, Eugene Coleman among them. And once Savage understood that Coleman was one of the people talking, the campaign against him escalated from suspicion into something closer to psychological warfare. It started with visits. Kidada Savage found Coleman in a prison visiting room and pulled him aside, telling him not to let the cracker system break him, words that sounded on the surface like encouragement between old friends. The undertone was something else entirely. Not long after, she followed up with a letter, ending it with a line Coleman could not read as anything but a threat to his own blood. Death before dishonor to your family. Then came the holding cell. Waiting at the federal courthouse, Coleman found himself seated beside Kiboni Savage and one of Savage's men. Savage did not waste the opportunity. He started talking, unprompted, about rats and about how their families deserved to die right along with them. This was not tough talk performed for an audience. Prison phone calls recorded around the same period caught Savage saying it in his own voice, dreaming out loud about killing informants, promising that their mothers would pay and their kids would pay, describing himself as dedicated to their death. The man was not posturing. He was planning, and every threat he made was building toward a decision he had already settled on. That paranoia had a clear trigger. Once Savage's cocaine connect was arrested and the people he did business with started getting swept up one after another, the empire he had spent a decade building began losing pieces faster than he could replace them. And losing pieces made him certain that someone close to him was talking. He started reaching out for home addresses on everyone he had ever dealt with. He started asking about their children specifically. Not their wives, not their brothers, but their kids, because he understood better than most that the surest way to control a grown man was to threaten the people that man could not protect. Agents listening through the bug in his cell caught every word of it. His own lawyer, watching the case against his client thicken with every recorded call, told him flatly to stop, to stay quiet, to stop digging the hole deeper for himself and his co-defendants. Savage was not built to take that advice. He had run his own organization for the better part of a decade without answering to anyone, and a lawyer's warning delivered over a jailhouse phone was never going to be the thing that stopped a man who believed, the way he had always believed, that violence solved problems words could not. By the time federal agents had Savage's cell fully wired and were logging his calls day after day, a clear picture had formed of a man who could not separate the idea of an informant from the idea of that informant's entire bloodline. Eugene Coleman was still cooperating. Kidada Savage was still delivering the threats in person, one visiting room conversation and one letter at a time. And somewhere between the blood oath, the letter, and the holding cell conversation about rats and their families, Kiboni Savage had already decided exactly what he was going to do about it. By October 2004, Eugene Coleman was in federal custody and set to testify against Savage in the drug trafficking case that could put him away for good. Savage, watching his empire come apart one cooperating witness at a time, made the call that would define the rest of his life. From inside the federal detention center in Philadelphia, he ordered his sister to have Coleman's house burned down with the family inside. Kidada Savage passed the instruction to Lamont Lewis, the same hitman who had already killed for the organization more than once. The plan was specific from the start. She told Lewis to hit the house at night when the family would be home. She drove him down North 6th Street herself and pointed out the exact row house, warning him that there might be guns inside and a pit bull. Lewis brought in his cousin, Robert B.J. Merritt Jr., to help carry it out. Kidada promised the two men $5,000 for the job. At around 4 a.m. on October 9, 2004, Lewis and Merritt pulled up outside the house with 2 cans of gasoline. Lewis kicked in the door and fired shots up the staircase to keep anyone from escaping. Merritt lit the gasoline and threw the cans inside. The fire started in the living room and moved fast through the row house. It took roughly 20 minutes for firefighters to put it out. There were no survivors. 6 people died inside that house. Marcella Coleman, Eugene's 54-year-old mother, was found on the floor, apparently trying to reach the children. Demir Jenkins, Eugene's son, was 15 months old. Kaja Nash was 10. Taj Porchea was 12. Sean Rodriguez was 15. Tamika Nash, Kaja's mother and Eugene's cousin, was 34. The family's pit bull died in the fire as well. It remains the deadliest mass murder in Philadelphia since the Lex Street killings 4 years earlier. What came next, captured on the same prison recordings that had already caught Savage plotting the attack, showed exactly what kind of man had given the order. After Eugene Coleman was briefly released from custody to attend his family's funeral, agents recorded Savage remarking that someone should have poured barbecue sauce on them, calling the victims burnt bitches. He joked about the infant who died, calling him a mouse born from a rat. He joked about the family dog too, calling it a rat in pit bull's clothing. He was not horrified by what had happened. He was entertained by it, and on other calls around the same period, he talked about wanting to smack a 4-year-old with a bat and threatened to shoot another witness's 5-year-old daughter. Kadada Savage showed her own version of that coldness. The fire on North 6th Street was meant to silence one witness. Instead, it became the crime that defined Kibone Savage more than any drug deal, any shooting, or any corner he ever controlled. An empire built block by block in North Philadelphia, backed by a decade of violence and a crew willing to kill on command, ended with a man locked in a cell more than 1,500 miles from the streets that made him remembered not as a kingpin who beat the system, but as the man who burned 6 people alive, 4 of them children, because one of his own decided to tell the truth.